If you've made it this far into the section, I've got some great news, which is that there's no more installation or configuration left. We have everything set up. Prisma is up and running, and it's time to start taking advantage of what it has to offer. What we're going to start to do in this video is explore the GraphQL Prisma API. This is auto-generated for us, and it allows us to interact with our database. So as we perform mutations, we're actually writing to our database. As we perform queries and subscriptions, we're actually reading from the database. Now, all of these get automatically generated based off of the contents of datamodel.graphql. So you'll notice that all of these are user related because the only model we actually have is a user. If we were to add other ones like comments and posts, we would see auto-generated queries, mutations, and subscriptions for those as well. So briefly, under queries, we have a way to fetch multiple users and a way to fetch a single user. Under mutations, we have ways to create, update, and delete our users, as well as a couple of other ways we can mutate our users. And finally, we have a user subscription, allowing us to subscribe to user changes, whether a user gets created, updated, or deleted. To kick things off, let's go ahead and write to our database by using the create user mutation. And if we actually click on that, we can learn how create user works. Create user takes a single argument data and it sends back the user itself. So we know what to do when we get a user back. We're going to select the fields we want, but what exactly do we pass in to data? We pass in an instance of user create input. So down below under arguments, we can actually click data to view what user create input takes. Right here, we can see it just takes a string. So on the data argument, we have to provide a name field of the type string. That's all we need to actually create a user and to write some data to the database. So let's go ahead and kick things off. I'm going to collapse the schema, and we're actually going to use create user right here, a new mutation. We are going to create user. Then we're going to pass in our arguments and set up our selection set. I'm just going to grab the ID and the name of the user we create, the two fields we actually have listed. Now we do have to provide our argument, so let's set that up as well. We're going to provide data, the one and only argument we need, and we know the only field we have to provide on data is name, where we set up our string name. I'm going to go ahead and just use my name. I'll use Andrew Mead. Perfect. And there we go. Now we can actually fire off this mutation. What we get back is the data we probably expected. We have our root data property. We then have create user, which matches up with the mutation name. And in there, we have all of the data we asked for about the user we just created. What's cool though is that the data is not just living in some array or something like local storage. It's actually being stored in our Postgres database. So let's go ahead and move over to pgadmin and actually view this data. I'm going to crack open pgadmin, and right here I have the database. You should have your database already expanded. We did that in the installation video, and the only one we care about under our database is schemas. Now the data has changed since we first opened pgadmin, since we have executed Prisma. We need to refresh our schemas to see the latest changes right here. You can just right-click schema and click refresh, and we only need to do that when we actually make a change to that data structure. Now if we expand this, we can view all of the various schemas we have, and by default, our data is stored under default $default. So we're going to open that up. And in there, we are interested in exploring the tables. That is where our data lives. So down below, we have tables, and we have a table for every single model we define. So here we defined one type user, and we have a table that stores all of our users. And we can actually view the data in a nice way by right-clicking that table name, going to view edit data, and just selecting all rows. Here, as a sort of Excel sheet, we're going to be able to view all of the data in our database. We have just one row, one user. We have the ID value under the ID header. We have name under name, Andrew Mead. And I also have updated at and created at, which are automatically added by Prisma itself. We'll learn more about these and how we can actually use them a bit later. Created at gets set once when the record is first created, and updated at gets updated anytime we change our data. In this case, the only thing we can change is name. So anytime the name changed, updated at would be updated to reflect the timestamp when the name was actually changed. All right, so we have all of our data right here. This is a great first step. We can clearly see that with Prisma, we're able to manipulate our database using a GraphQL API. Let's go ahead and add another user into the mix. I'm going to pick a random name for this user. I'll use Vikram, and we're going to run that. And now we should see Vikram showing up in the database as well. Over here, I can refresh the data being shown by clicking this little lightning bolt. Not exactly the clearest icon, but it will indeed make another query for your data. And now we can see we have 2 records showing up. Now we can also fetch our data using the GraphQL API provided by Prisma. Right here, for example, there are a few different ways to get that done. We have a users query to fetch multiple users, and we have a user query to fetch a single user. Let's go ahead and mess around with users for the moment. Now, users does take some arguments, but they're all completely optional. So we can just grab all of our users, deciding what data we want from each. I'm going to set that up right here. A query operation. We are using the users query. It requires no arguments, so we're not going to provide any. You can take my word for that. And then we're going to define what we want off of each user. We'll just grab everything, the name and the ID. Excellent. Now, if we actually fire this off, what do we get? We get all of our users back. I have Andrew Mead as the first one and Vikram as the second one. All of these live under the users array stored on our root data property. And this is exactly the sort of structure we would have expected, and it's the sort of structure we actually see with our very own application. So there's nothing magical about exactly how Prisma sends data back. It's going to look the same as it looked when we were using GraphQL Playground with our own app. What's nice, though, is we do not need to create the mutations, the queries, or the subscriptions. Prisma does that for us. All right, let's go ahead and explore one more together. Then I'll give you a challenge. Well, you'll have to use one on your own. Right here, we're going to go ahead and use update user to change the name for one of our users. Now, if we look at update user, we can see it takes a few different arguments. And this is where you're going to start to get a bit more familiar with the definitions for various operations. So it's necessary to actually dig into the schema and see how things work. Right here, we can see that with update user, we get a user back as expected. And we can see that it takes 2 arguments. It takes data, where we provide the things we want to change, and it takes a where argument. This is where we define which user we're trying to update. If we look at data, we can see the only thing we can change is the name. Obviously, that makes a lot of sense. If we open up where, though, we can see the only thing we can search by is the ID. So we have to provide the ID for the user we're trying to change, and we also have to provide the data we're trying to change. Let's go ahead and actually knock that out by creating a new mutation. Right here, another mutation. I'm going to set this up and I'll call it update user. This one does take arguments, so we have to provide them. We have to provide where. Where is an object, and we have to provide the ID. So we can filter users by their ID. And I'm going to go ahead and update one of these users. I'll update the user that I created for myself, and I'm just going to change the name, removing the last name. If I copy the ID, I can bring it over to this tab and paste it right there between the quotes for the ID property. Next up, we have to define data as well. So comma, enter, setting up data. That also equals an object. On here, we can determine what exactly we'd like to update. There's only one thing to update currently, and it's name. I'm going to change it to Andrew, removing the last name. Last up, we have to provide our selection set. So we get a user back. What do we want to know about that user we just changed? I'm going to grab their ID, and I'm going to grab the name. If we actually fire off this operation, we can see that what we get back looks like a success. We have our data update user properties, and we have the data we've actually changed, with the name being the new version. I can go ahead and rerun that users query to see the exact same thing. And finally, if I refresh the data in pgadmin, I can see that the last name has been removed from that very first user. Now that we've messed around with a couple of these queries, mutations, and subscriptions together, what I'd like you to do is figure out how to use delete user. I want you to delete the second user we created. So in this case, I want to delete Vikram. You might have a different name. Either way, you want to figure out how to use delete user by exploring the schema and actually knock that out to delete one. Then go ahead and rerun the user's query to make sure it's gone, and refresh pgadmin to make sure it's removed from there as well. Take as much time as you need to knock that one out, dig into the documentation to figure out how it works, remove the record, test your work, and when you're done, click play. All right, how'd that one go? Hopefully you were able to get everything up and running without too much trouble. I'm going to start by digging into the documentation. There's no better way to learn how something works. Right here we have delete user for deleting users, and we can see that it returns the user that was deleted, and it takes a single argument where. It's of the type user where unique input, and we can explore what exactly lives on there down below. The only thing we can delete a user by is their ID, which is great. That's exactly what we're going to end up doing. So right here, what do? First, we need the ID of the user we're trying to remove. I have that sitting right here, so I'm going to copy it to the clipboard. Then we're going to move over to a new tab and set up our delete user mutation. So we have a mutation operation. The mutation is called delete user. We are indeed going to be providing some arguments, just where. That's an object. We set up the ID property on that object, setting the value equal to the ID we just copied. You could break this onto multiple lines if you like. You could leave it as a single line too. Typically though, if I do have objects, I like to break things onto multiple lines like we've been doing previously throughout the course. From here, we have to provide our selection set. So what do we get back? We get back that deleted user, and I'm going to grab the ID and the name for the user that was removed. If I go ahead and fire off this operation, what do I get? Right here, I get the data property. I have delete user on there, and I have the information that I selected for the deleted user. Now, if I rerun that user's query, I should no longer see that second record, and I can see that it has been removed. And lastly, if I refresh the data view over in pgadmin, I can see it's been removed from there as well. And this is fantastic. We now have a way to perform all of those CRUD operations using the auto-generated GraphQL API provided by Prisma. We can create data, we can read data, we can update data, and we can delete data. Now we've gotten a little taste of what the API actually provides. Clearly there are plenty of things we have not used, but what's great is that the queries, mutations, and subscriptions would be the same even if we were using a different database. If I switched over to MySQL or MongoDB, we wouldn't need to change any of our code. It could all stay exactly the same. So Prisma abstracts away the implementation details of our database, allowing us to just focus on what our application needs to do, and that is a huge bonus. Now from here, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to learn how to set up a more realistic data model inside of Prisma. Right now, we just have users, and they only have 2 fields, and one of them has something that we don't even know about. In the next video, we're going to spend a lot of time in this file, making it look a lot more like the schema we had set up previously. We're going to have users, we're going to have posts, and we're going to have comments. All right, that is it for now. Let's go ahead and jump right into the next one and make some changes to datamodel.graphql.